The sea is black and endless. Icebergs grind and shift around you, groaning like giants in the night. You've been in a kayak for over 3 months, shoulders screaming, fingers numb, every breath a cloud in the Arctic cold. The tent shakes in the wind, but it isn't the storm that wakes you. It's the sound of claws scraping against the canvas. A polar bear leans its full weight into your fragile shelter. You're alone. There's no rescue plane coming, no port in sight, just you, your paddle, and the thin line between survival and disaster. This is what today's guest chose. He wasn't a lifelong kayaker or a seasoned polar guide. He was a journalist who failed twice at rowing the Atlantic, rescued in humiliating fashion, left wondering if he really was an adventurer at all. And yet, instead of quitting, he came back stronger, wiser, determined to prove, mostly to himself, that failure wasn't the end. It was the beginning. In 2023, after 103 days at sea with 3 teammates, he became the first person to kayak the entire Northwest Passage, 2 world records, European Adventurer of the Year, and perhaps more importantly, proof that you don't have to be fearless to do the impossible. You just have to keep paddling when everything tells you to stop. This is why you think you could do that. And this is Mark Agnew. Mark, welcome to the show.
Wow, that was a very poetic bit about the polar bear. I was, as you were reading it out, I was thinking, is this from my book? It sounds better than anything I could have written. And then thank you. The very kind introduction. It made me sound much more hardcore than I am.
Well, I don't know, Mark. After doing all my research, this is going to be a pretty epic interview. There's so much to it, but from the outside. Now, from all of my research, it really does seem that you were destined to adventure, but in truth, your path started a lot more ordinary. So take me back to your childhood in Edinburgh. What kind of kid were you?
Well, yeah, this is, now that I do what I do, people see my background and think, oh, well, it makes sense now because, my dad is like a proper explorer, capital E, like mapping part of Patagonia and expeditions to Greenland, unclimbed peaks or Himalayas, whatnot. And my mum was a journalist and I ended up becoming an adventure sports journalist. So the two of those coming together, you don't have to be a professional psychologist. But equally, my mum was an adventurer. And she flew to Australia in her 20s in the 1970s and then worked her way back overland through the Southeast Asia and the Middle East, which is as dangerous as it is being on a knife-edge ridge in the Himalayas like my dad. So it all seems obvious, but it didn't feel inevitable. And I certainly wasn't like planning on it. What I really wanted to do was just play rugby, and I did a lot of sailing, and as a family, we were outdoorsy and we did camping holidays and whatnot. But then by the time I was 12, I just wanted to play rugby and basically stopped sailing and doing a bit of hiking like every now and then. But I was just playing rugby. On Wednesdays, Saturdays and Sundays for a while, I had 3 different teams. I was just playing rugby. But yeah, so it wasn't like just this. In fact, I didn't even realize until sort of these big questions started coming up and I started looking back and saying, oh yeah, I guess there is that adventure thing and the journalist thing all coming together. It didn't seem obvious to me. We certainly weren't like regaled with stories of adventure over the dinner table that made me like, sit with my jaw open and want to be like my dad or mum. In fact, my dad's he tells me great stories now because they organically come up. I might say something and it reminds him of a time he was on sea ice and he says, oh yeah, well, funnily enough in 1966, but it was my mum who would tell most of the stories. So it was sort of my mum's anecdotes that infused adventure into us. So yeah, what kind of kid was I? I was like basically quite normal. Probably I was a class clown. I was like cheeky, but I wasn't. And I probably have a list of teachers who really don't like me, but equally I wasn't like a rebel. I wasn't I wasn't like completely off the rails. I was doing fine at school and working as basically as hard or as little as I needed to get B's because I didn't have any particular ambition and just spending the rest of the time playing rugby and I sort of going about my business.
So then your father, who is a very well-known adventurer, Sir Crispin Agnew, you didn't grow up really appreciating, was it, that the adventures that he had done?
Well, I'd say my dad's been on Everest and stuff like that. Well, basically, it was only the Everest one because like everybody knows what that is, and as a 9-year-old or whatever, you don't understand what it means to go to Patagonia. And even when I did get excited about it later, I thought, oh, I want to do the stuff that my dad did. Um, but it's only now that I'm like 34 when I think he was 21 or 22 when he went to Greenland for the first time, and two people died. And he's just like getting on with life afterwards. Like it's these huge things that we would all be therapizing and having PTSD about and processing, and he was just spending 6 months by himself, and well, not by himself but with his team in the middle of nowhere and dealing with death and then getting on with it, and at 21 or 22, and then a few years later leading his first expedition to Greenland at 25 or 6. And yeah, those are it's the ages now that really like strike me, rather than as well as the incredible feats.
So did you feel any pressure or inspiration, motivation from your family background to become an adventurer?
Not at all. I didn't feel pressure to do anything. I mean, as I say, I was doing rugby, and both my parents, who have no interest or background in rugby, just threw themselves 100% into me wanting to pursue whatever it was I wanted to pursue. So, I boarded, so I lived at school, but my mum would drive in and pick me up, so take me to the fitness sessions that my club was doing outside of school, and just trying to full on facilitate that. And I look back and, certainly like just after school, I felt like I had messed up a couple of opportunities to be picked in some bigger teams. And I look back and I'm like, well, that is all on me, because everybody was doing everything they could to give me like the platform I needed to reach my potential or not. And I was just being too lazy to do it. So they were like full on taking it. I guess the pressure I did feel is like, I say pressure jokingly. I like teasing my mum about this, and sometimes it comes across like I'm not teasing my mum, because I'm glad she says this. But she'd always like make us pick the most interesting option. What are you going to tell your grandkids? Which she'd say to us. And even if I'd say, oh, so and so's out of school and he's already on 200K a year. Yeah, but what's he going to tell his grandkids? Or I got suspended. Yeah, and I got suspended from school a couple of times, and obviously at the time it was like a huge deal, and I got in a lot of trouble. But like, she's like, oh, I was always a little bit happy that my kids like had a bit of personality, and I do, you don't want them straight A students, pass their driving test on their first attempt, go to Cambridge, boring. But it was so good. But then I do have a bit of an existential crisis that like, what am I going to tell my grandkids? Like, my life is not interesting enough. Like, and it was, I guess it was really when I got out of uni and I'm like doing my first few office jobs, and I'm staring at the wall thinking, this cannot be it. This cannot be it. And I feel that question in like a visceral sense. Oh, please don't let this be it. And that is really when, when I talk about all my motivations and I really thought hard about why I wanted to do this. And I sometimes forget that how much of a driver it was, that I just cannot face the boredom. And people are never satisfied with the question, like, what, like Mallory, who tried to climb Everest 100 years ago. Why do you want to do it? Because it's there. And I think that's just like a flippant answer to get rid of somebody, because really, like, nobody's satisfied with the answer. Like, why do you want to go and risk your life? Or because I enjoy it. But why do you enjoy it? It sounds miserable. Well, I think that part of the reason it's difficult to justify is because nobody else is given that level of scrutiny. Why do you want to be a banker? Oh, well, it's just, it's an interesting job. It's interesting, but why? Why is it interesting to you? Why? So like, nobody else is given that level of scrutiny. And I basically cannot think of a good reason to do like a really boring job where I just stare at a wall forever. And that answer has changed a little bit because I have kids now, and you do want to give them opportunities. So like money serves a different role. So now I sound like I'm being dismissive now to people who are working hard for their families. Um, and but at 21, I was just like, I can't think of a reason to do this. I've got to do something interesting. And that all stemmed from you got to do something for the grandkids.
So then what was the first small step that you remember that really pushed you outside your comfort zone?
Well, I mean, I guess the first step for the Rowing the Atlantic was a friend just sending me, I think it was through Facebook, like a video of people who doing it and saying, let's do this. And we were very naive, like, okay, cool. Well, they do it in December and we're going to graduate in June or July. And we don't want to, like, everybody parties at the end of uni. So you don't want to miss that. So we'll have to spend a couple of months partying. Then we'll start training in August. Then we'll raise the money by December and blah, blah, blah. We'll go. And it takes years to raise the money in particular and training as well. So that didn't happen that winter. But when we did go and try row the Atlantic in 2016, it was he and I with a much bigger team as well around us. So that was like the moment where a specific idea started to crystallize. But yeah, but it was more broad. But I guess it was broader, sort of gears turning as well.
So that first attempt, 2016, you're there, ready to go, you set off. How did you feel?
Relief, huge amount of relief. This like tension in my shoulders I didn't even realize I was carrying, because it's simple. It's really difficult. The stakes might be high. It might even be very dangerous, but it's simple. You're waking up to row from A to B. You're sleeping to recharge, to wake up to row from A to B. It's just the simplicity is absolute, and nothing else matters except for that one binary goal. That simplicity is a huge relief, and it took me by surprise because it should have been the moment of peak nerves and worry and whatnot. And that relief is just that stayed with me. Like, oh, I remember that feeling, and I want to go back again and again and again and have that simplicity. Heightened probably by the many worries leading up into the start of that adventure, where all of us were thinking, is this safe? There seems to be a lot wrong with the boat, and there's a lot of question marks that we all have. But then as soon as you start, those questions don't matter because there's nothing you can do about it anymore.
So how long was that adventure meant to last?
So we were saying we were going to be the first people to row the Atlantic in under 30 days. I think the record was like 34 or something at the time. And we were going to be break the 4-minute mile of ocean rowing. I don't know who called it the 4-minute mile, but probably us. But and it lasted, to be true to our word, we were there for less than 30 days. We were rescued after 48 hours. So
48 hours. So what went wrong?
So there's like a number of ways you can arrange to row the Atlantic. You can do it independently, where you just buy a boat, you get it to the coast of the Atlantic and you row. You could do it most people do it in a race called the Talisker Whiskey Atlantic Challenge, and where you pay a fee, you join the race. There's probably 30 boats. Or you can do a pay per place. So there's a captain and he'll sell 10 spots on the boat. And I guess objectively, it's safer because there's a captain on board. He's in charge. He's done it before. It's certainly cheaper. It's the cheapest option by far. Because you split it by most amount of people, and there's less admin because they arrange it. But I hear a lot of stories, and I've experienced 2 of them myself, where there's no oversight. There's not a governing body or whatever. So people are very disappointed, and that is the kindest way I can say. In danger. People are in danger because when you outsource it, you have no control, and who knows what the safety levels are going to be. That was the case with us. I joined a paper place with my friend Stuart, who had he sent me the initial message to row the Atlantic, and we joined a crew of 10 people, all who had paid up their sum.
Sorry, is this 10 on the one boat?
10 on one boat. So part of the reason we thought we could do it so quickly is because it was like a catamaran-shaped boat, 2 hulls, so it could go faster, but also it was much bigger, so we had 10 people, including the captain. And the boat was really coming apart that second night, and one of the guys was getting sick because he was sleeping in 2 or 3 inches of water and then rowing for 2 hours. And the official reason, or at least when the captain was like quoted in the newspapers, because like we had to save George, but the reality is George was scapegoats, and the boat was just like a paper mache bath. And it was, and also it wasn't a shock because in a week or two when we were all in the Canary Islands leading up to it, everybody was just thinking like, this boat seems, it doesn't seem like the night before. One of the guys, Howard, like walked around the boat and was like, I thought these particular holes were going to be sealed. So he just went around with a pool noodle and cut out pool noodles and put them into the holes and then put like sealant around it. And particularly, so when you're in a ocean rowing boat, you have a hatch, you shut the hatch, but instead he cut out squares to create the entrance to the cabin, and then rather than attaching a hatch, kept the squares, sort of drilled a hole through it with a piece of string so you could slot the square in and out as the door, which is not waterproof. And the waves were coming over the boat, and the back cabins were getting filled with water. And the guys in the back cabins would say that they would hear a bang, and then water would pour through the sides of the so-called door, and then they just like sleeping in water that's sloshing around. And for 48 hours, that is a long, long time to be very cold and very wet.
So
yeah.
48 hours, you get rescued. Obviously, that mission is abandoned. How did you feel after that?
Well, just very motivated to go again. Like, I was in the helicopter on the way back to land and already like saying to Stu, like, we're going again. Or at least in my head I was. And we're gonna do it ourselves. We're gonna do it properly next time. And I guess like the part of the reason that it was so easy to deal with is because it was so clear that we should have got off. This was a massive mistake. There was no option to go on. Let's get off. Let's restart. And we're going to come to my second one. But my second one, there was like a load of ambiguity whether it was the right decision or not to get off. And that one ate me alive, which is where the sort of mental health problems come from. But that first one was, let's just do it again. And very quickly, we were arranging a team, 4 friends this time, me, Stu, one of the other guys from the boat, who then dropped out. So you're going to do it as a 3 with a friend from school. So despite the fact that, he said the word humiliating in the intro, this one was way more public. With all the newspapers said Captain Calamity and quoted something I said on Facebook. So if you Googled it, I came up and it was very public. Whereas the second one, I had no publicity, but it felt far more crushing and humiliating despite that.
Okay, so let's talk about that second one. You set off. Again, there's 3 of you or 4 of you?
2 of us this time. So in the first one, so in between then, in between the first failure and the eventual start, getting to the start line is a very difficult process. So we eventually ended up not with either of my friends from school, going with a woman who I'd met through the race. So I entered the race this time, and they put me in contact with her when eventually it looked like I needed somebody and she needed somebody. And we set off again and have that same moment of relief. And we got 3 days this time, and we're having this problem with our battery. So you have solar panel and it charges the battery. The battery wasn't really charging, which meant that going into night, we had already very low power. And we were having to turn off a lot of things, including something that makes us visible on big ships' radar. And without it, we're invisible. So that's fine because one of us is rowing at night and one of us is sleeping, and we're taking it in turns. And as long as the person sort of keeps their eyes scanning the horizon, if we do see a ship, we have enough power to turn on our AIS or radar identifier thing for a few minutes or however long necessary. But then my friend was very much struggling, and that's her story to tell. So, but we eventually called for somebody to come pick her up, and then I'm left with the decision of whether or not to go on by myself or get off when she gets off. and going on by myself with a faulty battery and possibly turning the AIS off at night when I'm asleep with nobody on deck. And then, I wouldn't know if a ship had appeared on the horizon or not, seemed like crossing the line from objective risk to reckless risk. And when I explain it like that, everybody says, well, getting off is a sensible decision. But was I snatching at a face-saving excuse? Really, the battery wasn't that big an issue. It might have been something as simple as it was just cloudy and we were too far north, and in a few days when we got further south, it was going to sort itself out. What's the right decision? And I got off when she got off, and I didn't leave the decision behind. It ate me alive, and I just had this idea of myself as this adventurer, and I wasn't living up to it, and I felt utterly, utterly pathetic and humiliated. And every time somebody rode the Atlantic and it appeared in the newspaper, I just imagine my friends are reading it, thinking, oh, they must think, another one? God, rowing the Atlantic's easy. God, Mark's done it twice, he's failed. And somebody even floated across the Atlantic in a barrel a few weeks later, and I was like, that is salt in the wound.
So what was it that really hurt you the most about that second failure?
I just felt like I'd voluntarily given up. Like, there's a documentary on YouTube of people doing it, and they have somebody who's super seasick and he has to get off, and they're all considering getting off with him, and two of them stay and do it in a 4-person boat too. And even though it takes them twice as long, they do it. And I got off. The people who make these decisions, they stick to it, and I quit. So what does that say about me? I just felt, I guess, it's difficult to put my finger on, because it was more like a sense of worth rather than like I regret X, although I did regret getting off. It's more like I am worthless. So much of my self-worth is linked up in becoming an adventurer. And part of the problem was, on that first failed attempt, we were going to try and set the record. And I had not considered that initially. I didn't know that, I'm not a rower. I'm not a particularly gifted athlete. And I just believed my own sponsorship pitch, or just got caught up in the idea, or thought that we could do it. And therefore it became about becoming a world record setter. And that second one, me and the woman were going to be mixed pair world record. And so much of my self-worth had become utterly binary, like become an adventurer by finishing the Atlantic, by setting the world record. And I felt just so worthless and very rudderless for a long time.
You mentioned just before, just imagining what your friends must be thinking when they see someone had just rode the Atlantic. What were your friends and family actually saying to you?
In the context of the row and stuff, like supportive or interested. Although sometimes people are like, what happened? Because like I put a Facebook thing out, it didn't happen this year, the battery's going out, and people could see through it. And it sort of annoyed me that at points, like people were like I was some kind of circus freak. But what actually happened? I'm like, but generally nothing. I mean, this is the thing. I've imagined all of my friends like constantly thinking about how terrible I was at ocean rowing, and my friends are probably thinking not about me at all. You're all, nobody cares about you as much as you care about you, except for maybe your mum and dad. And yeah, it's just, the reality was it probably weren't. They were just getting on with their lives. They probably weren't even in the right space on the internet to be continuously exposed to people rowing the Atlantic. The idea that their algorithms were throwing that up is, it just, they didn't care.
Isn't it interesting, Mark, that we put so much attention and energy into thinking what other people are thinking about us, when, like you say, in actual fact, they're not thinking about us at all, because everyone has their own life to live.
Yeah. It was very much a projection. I felt worthless, so I sort of assumed they felt worthless, but they thought I was worthless. But I did have this one. Couldn't be bothered I had 4 friends who I saw in Hong Kong all the time, and I couldn't be bothered to tell the story 4 times. So I arranged like a all-you-can-drink brunch. I was like, I'm just going to tell you the story. It's going to take 20 minutes, and then we can just get on with the brunch. And it took like 5 hours, and that was very therapeutic. It was like chapter 1. Like the brunch had shut down and everybody had left, and they let us stay there. And yeah, that was great. Yeah.
So, what were your parents' reaction to it?
Very supportive and caring, and all the things you would expect of great parents. And indignant on my behalf when I needed to be, and whatnot. So everything you can expect. I mean, my parents just been so supportive throughout. Um, it's been quite incredible. But yeah, I was on the other side of the world. So, and it also is like, not like I was walking around in a state of depression, like unable to get out of bed. It's like sort of like I'm having fun in the fun moments, and it was sort of like a background noise of just negativity that I was telling myself. And also like a bit of a loss of drive. I said at the time a few times, I wanted to want to do something again. It's not even like I wanted to row the Atlantic again. I wanted to want to row the Atlantic again, but I was like, I just don't even want to do it. And I had such like a specific purpose of train to row the Atlantic, raise money for the Atlantic, whatever. And I'd lost that a little bit as well. So
I also saw, Mark, that you question yourself whether you're a person who does adventure or you're an adventurer. Explain that to me.
well, yeah, I mean, my idea had been bastardized by the world records, where I thought, well, I'm not an adventurer because I can't do it fast or whatnot. And I know people do it other ways, but I just don't want to do it that way. It doesn't seem like worth my time. And, adventurers have got to be, whether you're doing it fast or slow or whatever, you've got to be resilient and stoic and laugh in the face of adversity and camaraderie. And I had not lived up to any of those ideals by quitting and whatnot. So was I an adventurer? But yeah, this was the big corner I turned for the Northwest Passage. So in the build up to the Northwest Passage, because I knew so to go back, before rowing the Atlantic the first time, just becoming obsessed with the field and getting excited, I was Googling all sorts, and I saw somebody wanted to row the Northwest Passage. The first people to do it by human power. And a lot of people have been trying. There'd already been a rowing attempt and whatnot. And that caught my imagination. So I knew before I was going to the Atlantic that this was going to be a stepping stone to a much bigger, much harder world first attempt in the Arctic. And
so what was it about that spark then that really ignited your sense of adventure?
Well, even before I went to the Atlantic, I actually called the guy who had posted about the rowing and said, I'm going to come with you. I'm just about to set the world record for rowing the Atlantic. So I'm good. And then I'm going to call you afterwards and we're going to get going. And I was involved with him for a long time. And that was, I'm sure we will come to it, the worst moments of my life with him. And I think part of it was that extrinsic world record, world first part, where at the time I was becoming more and more focused on those extrinsic goals. And this seemed like a serious world first, because you can do any old world first, really. Like you could pick 2 points on either side of the ocean and say I'm the first to go between here and here. And like 16 people have rowed the North Atlantic solo, or maybe it's 17 or 18 now, something like up to 20. And still Guinness is giving world firsts for the first person to go from Boston to the Scilly Isles, the first person to go from New York to London, the first person to go from Newfoundland to Scotland. And they're all amazing adventures and unbelievably hardcore. So I don't want to sound like I'm diminishing them, but I am diminishing the idea that they are world firsts. Guinness just give out, a lot of adventurous in the Guinness is a bit of a joke. But going to the Northwest Passage, it was legitimized as a real first, perhaps the last first of those kind of polar history, golden age of polar exploration in the 19th century, because it wasn't recently contrived. The first people to try and find it were sent by Henry VIII and then Elizabeth I, and then in the 19th century, Franklin and Ross, and then Abbotston, the most famous of all the Arctic explorers, he was the first person to make it through, and then the first people to sail through, and then there's the first people to get through by human power, and people have been trying it. So I wouldn't be the first to do it and the first to try it. And that was like this is a real first. And if I did this, I'd be a serious adventurer. So I think I was drawn by that extrinsic bit a lot. There's also all the history that I'd read. I was obsessed with like Shackleton and Abbotston and Scott, reading those books. I guess we talked earlier about my upbringing. I definitely read those when I was younger. So it all came together in this like, wow, this is cool. There's something left where I can be like my heroes.
So this spark obviously ignites before you even thought about rowing across the Atlantic. You have 2 failed attempts in the Atlantic. The period between the Atlantic attempts and your Northwest Passage, describe that period of time.
So these include the worst moments of my life, and the same mistake again. So for a year or two, I felt lost after the Atlantic. And then the guy who I'd originally called about doing the Northwest Passage then put into motion in, say, late 2019 that he's going to do it. And he needs a team, and he's a paper place. So he needs money, etc. But I knew him a little bit. He lives in Scotland. He helped with the second Atlantic row. My parents had been down to his house a few times to pick some kit up and things, and he was so trustworthy, I thought. And a lot of money, £50,000 per seat. And obviously then COVID happened. So it's getting delayed. So there's a lot of delays and external factors. And, but I was like, even though I don't want to do something again, I'm self-aware enough that if I don't, I will miss this opportunity and regret this. So sometimes you have to feel ready to do something, and sometimes you do something and it makes you feel ready. You can't just, the action of getting out of the house is the one that makes you feel like you want to get out of the house. So signing up like put me back on an even keel. But equally, I didn't want to, there was even a higher risk of failure, and I didn't want to go back to the place that I felt before. So I started reaching out to some psychologists, equally because I knew I wanted to write a book, and I was going to like weave in, like, I don't know, which I have done now. It's called There Will Be Headwinds. And, it's not like a self-help book, but there's 8 chapters out of 30 something, which are interviews with psychologists I did during this period. And it was going to be about resilience with a bit of teamwork and whatnot. And I thought that the resilient psychologist would tell me it's about being tough. This is how you get tougher. But the first one said, well, what is it you mean by being an adventurer? And maybe you're measuring it wrong. And why do you want to be an adventurer? And what is it that you enjoy? And asking all of these questions, and gave me this framework. They said there's only 3 reasons people do sport, or narratives people tell themselves for the reason they're doing sport. Performance, relationships, and discovery. So are you doing it because performance, I want to win, and that's binary. You win 2-0 and you win, you lose 2-0 and you lose, and there's nothing else in between. Relationships, are you doing it because the team spirit, or people do sport because it can do it with their dad or whatever? Or discovery, is it because of the new experiences it exposes you to? And like, it was like a light bulb. I was like, yeah, I do this because of relationships. I would never do this by myself. I've always said I would like to get to the other side and have a beer in a week, a year, and 10 years and say, we did something special together. And discovery, I wouldn't want to row 3,000 miles backwards and forwards along Hong Kong Harbor. I want to be immersed in nature, the waves and experiences that we had in those 2 or 3 days in the first failed Atlantic attempts were powerful and amazing. And the swells and the shadow from the moon was just spectacular. But performance, somebody had once said, I want to set the world record. Can you come with me? And suddenly I was like, I want to be a world record setting adventurer. And my worth and my definition of adventure success had become completely binary. So I started trying to like do retrain my mind. In COVID in Hong Kong, there was no real lockdown. There was big travel restrictions, but you could do whatever you wanted within certain rules in the region itself. So Fred and I went kayaking, and it was, was no record. It was new to me though, and the discovery element of going to these islands called Double Haven in a remote part of Hong Kong was amazing. And like, there was one point where there was these huge waves like rolling in, and I was finding it really challenging, and I was having to focus, and there was cliffs next to us. So if I did go over, I would have been in real trouble. And I was shouting to myself, like, concentrate, try and stay upright. And we came around the headland and into protected water. And that was like the moment where I was like, this is adventure. And like, it was like, it was like, it was like a smoke that I'd inhaled. It was just coming out of my nose and ears, and it left me. And, it continued to be like a process, but that was one of those big moments. And equally, like, I did a lot of ultra running, or no, I did a trail running and a bit of ultra running in Hong Kong, because there's a huge community there of ultra runners, like massive. And my job was to cover them for the newspaper. And the good thing about that is that I have literally no hope in the world of being a good ultra runner. I'm built like a rugby player. I did this 100K. I set myself the goal of doing it in under 24 hours. The winners are doing it in 10 hours. So that's the context of. So that's like, I can't be like, I want to be a world record setter, because it would just be ridiculous. So that was like a relief, because there's only one way to engage in it, and that was sort of on my own terms. And bit by bit, I learned relearned all of the things I loved. And when I went to the Arctic, I sort of thought that initially this was supposed to be a padding against any inevitable failure, because I could say, well, what I really want is to be a world first setting adventurer. But if I'm not, at least I can say I had an experience of immersion in nature, or I made new camaraderie with my friends. But the irony was, I'm now a motivational speaker, and this is basically the crux of my point, is like, if you let go of the outcome and focus on loving the pursuit, then the outcome looks after itself. I'm going to go tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day, because it immerses me in nature. Even if the end is unlikely or likely, it's irrelevant. And I'm going to push myself tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, not because it draws me closer to the end, but because it draws me closer to my teammates. And then day after day, you get closer to the end and you're like, hey, I'm here. Whereas if you're only focused on the end and today's going slowly, it's just frustrating, and you eventually burn out, because you're like, well, this is an obstacle between me and the end. Whereas if what you want is to be close to your teammates, you're like, well, here I am. So, yeah, it's ironic.
Yeah. So you mentioned adventure in Hong Kong, kayaking, came around the headland into the calmer waters. And we don't need to set off and cross polar ice caps or sail around Antarctica to experience adventure. We can all experience adventure, for all the listeners, in our own individual way. And adventure is just something, quite often, just going out, stepping outside your comfort zone, going out and experiencing new experiences. And is that what that moment was for you? Just something new, something exhilarating, exciting?
Yeah, exactly. It was just so that initial framework that I was given in my performance, I've now sort of put it into my own language. There's only 4 intrinsic motivations: challenge, experience, relationships, or causes. Are you doing it to challenge yourself, which I suppose is a sort of an intrinsic version of performance, because you can say, I challenged myself, whether or not you win. Challenge, experience, relationships, or causes might be raising money for charity. And I can't think of a motivation that doesn't fall under one of those 4 those things. And when you have intrinsic motivations, just far, I mean, that is what adventure is. Adventure is not about where you start and finish. It's everything that happens in between. And for me, it was challenging. The experience was unique because it was a place in Hong Kong I hadn't been to, and beautiful, because Hong Kong the coastline is very remote and amazing, unlike what you'd expect. I did it with this guy I just met, and we became friends. I wasn't doing it for a cause, but so it just all of these internal loves of adventure. It was like such a wonderful experience, and there was no binary goal. There was like, it, maybe now if I went back and did it, now that that was my first day essentially kayaking. I went and did 40 kilometers along a remote coastline, and it was very difficult. And maybe now I'd be like, because I've done this bigger thing, or maybe I'd be more scared because I'd be like, this is crazy to be out here with a lack of experience. Maybe I didn't have like the information I needed to realize how much danger I was in. But yeah, it was just about doing it. And I have, now that I give talks and I have workshops, I've come up with these frameworks and I have the language to explain it. And at the time I didn't. So, it's difficult to know what am I projecting back in terms of what exactly I thought, but I knew what I felt. What I felt was, this is it. And whether I knew what it was just like wonderful and amazing and beautiful.
So you're in Hong Kong. It's 2020, 2021 when you're experiencing these moments on the coastline in your kayak. 2 years before you set off to do the Northwest Passage, how did you prepare for such a massive task?
So at this point, I'm still planning on rowing it, and it's with the guy who I paid £50,000 to. The first time I tried to row the Atlantic was the fittest I've ever been, and I could crack out a time on a rowing machine which like still boggles my mind. And the second time I did a much more like big aerobic base fitness, like slow, low heart rates that would be sustained for hours. Admittedly, even the first time I could do 20 kilometers. If anybody understands splits on rowing machines, I could do 20 kilometers at a split of 159 on a rowing machine. And the second time I was like resilient in a physical sense, like I was making sure I had strong, flexible hips and my posterior chain was strong and I could row forever. The third time, I still took my fitness very seriously, but like a huge element of uncertainty, adversity, resilience, mental training. So I would row out onto the backside of an island called Lama, which in the winter is very exposed to these big swells, by myself, just like cracking on with it. And, I probably could have got my heart rate higher if I'd sat on a rowing machine in the gym, but it was more about like staying calm. During the kayaking, it was like, it was really putting me out of my comfort zone because I'm not a kayaker. And there was one big crossing we did, which was through an amber rainstorm. So the visibility was like nil, and we knew there was ships everywhere. And it was across this very, very busy about 5 different shipping channels. And it was about staying calm. And I just built up this like iron mind. And even more specifically than just general uncertainty, I was anticipating stuff I might have in the Northwest Passage, like not having a clear finish line. If you do 100K, right, if I just do 10 more, it's going to be over. But in the Northwest Passage, there might be a headwind or ice that means that you don't know if you're going to land in the next hour or 5 hours. So I went out in a rowing boat from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., so overnight by myself. So I had boredom, nothing to stimulate myself, on my own, and did a 4-kilometer strip backwards and forwards between these places called Deepwater Bay and Repulse Bay, I think. And I was passing the boathouse every half an hour so I could get out if I wanted to. And because it was 12 hours instead of a distance, no matter how much I pushed myself, the end didn't come any closer because it was 12 hours. And in that 12 hours, if I covered 120K or 70K, it was going to be 12 hours. So I was practicing like pushing myself without making the end come any closer. So in the Northwest Passage, I could say, well, I don't know if the end's going to be soon or later, but I got to learn how to push myself without that like carrot of knowing that I'm going to get out in half an hour. And I built up this mind. So in addition to like, resilience is really about like re-examining why you like something. And if you know why, then the how becomes easy. It's also about actually becoming tough, becoming like really calm in uncertainty, and making sure that if I ever found myself in an uncertain situation like I did in the second Atlantic, where it wasn't about rowing, it was about sitting there and trying to weigh up decisions about batteries and stuff, I knew that I would be able to be calm. And I thought I'd get to a place where I could grin and bear it and be like, hey, I'm tough now. but I got to a place where I'd enjoy it. And like when situations escalated, I was like, here we go. This is what we're here for. And you just like get the best time of your life. So yeah, I mean, by the time I got to the Northwest Passage, the first night was like chaos and went really badly. And I was like, this is so much fun, which is just like crazy to think that from a few years ago. But yeah, and then obviously I made a very late switch to kayaking, and I really had to uh, try my best to get up to speed with kayaking. I never really did.
So you pay a guy £50,000, which is in Australian money, it's a bucket load of cash. You could probably
Yeah,
buy a
yeah.
house for that.
Yes. Yeah.
And you've been getting ready, preparing for quite a long time to row the Northwest Passage. How did that all fall apart?
So yeah, I got about £30,000 in sponsorship. So £20,000 of my own money, just before anybody thinks I'm that loaded. But £20,000 is still is a lot of money, and you know, it was delayed because of COVID, and that is true. But there was also a lot of other lack of progress points that a lot of the crew were getting worried about. But you know, we had time because COVID delayed it, and it was delayed again. And then there was talk of rowing the boat from, well, we're going to delay again, but we're going to row from Iceland to the start of the Northwest Passage. So at least we're doing something this year. And at that point, I really had to, right, what have I learned? I'm not here for the external first. I'm here for a immersion in nature, camaraderie. This is going to be amazing. I'm going to go around the tip of Greenland and stuff like that. And then like there just wasn't replies, and trying to think of what I could say, because within my book, there's a lot of, so eventually people were becoming worried about the lack of action, lack of communication, what's happening. The boat doesn't seem ready. It's been another year and we're delaying again, and this Iceland thing's not happening. And there were four of us who were sort of the most vocal. Well, I'm not even sure if that's true. I mean, I was one of the most vocal. I don't know about the others. But we were also one of the only four who'd actually paid 50K each. So other people who weren't being vocal had paid as little as 5K. People were struggling to get to this enormous moment. And so we were in our rights to maybe wonder. And eventually I was sick of also getting phone calls from other people and saying, what's happening? You know the guy the best. He's from Scotland. Can you ask him? I was like, I've just had a kid. I can't deal with all of this. So I made a WhatsApp group without the captain. What's happening? What do we want to do? We got to have a meeting with him or get him on a Zoom call or whatever. And obviously everybody's very angry, and it's a very there's a lot of emotions in this WhatsApp group. And somebody tells the captain about the WhatsApp group and tells him that I've started it. So we get this horrific message, each individual one to four of us, and everybody else gets a message to saying Mark is like a man who's trying to drown us, and as soon as we get rid of him, it'll be like a second breath of fresh air. The reason that we haven't been able to go is because we haven't got enough money, and the reason we don't have enough money is because nobody's paying up, and the reason nobody's paying up is because Mark's in the background like undermining us. At this point, he has maybe like £400,000 or £500,000. So even if I wanted to undermine him, I couldn't. Like there's nothing the power dynamic there. It's no matter how much I whined. So he gave us an ultimatum, like shut up and get on board, or get off the team and I'll do my best to pay you back, which is quite a vague promise. And that vague promise has never been given back. And I thought to myself, what are all the things I've learned in my interviews about resilience, and how am I going to exhibit them now? Focus on what you could control. Right, well, my destiny as an adventurer is in my hands. If I want to be an adventurer, I can go on an adventure. I actually do own 2 kayaks now. So I'm going to go to my parents' house where I keep the kayaks. I'm going to get them. I'm going to go on an adventure. So I'm in control. An adventure is about being immersed in nature, doing what you love. So I'm going to go to the West Coast. I'm going to kayak along the coast. I'm going to hike up these mid-roads. And I felt back in control, and it was all very emotional, and it was difficult to deal with, but I was trying to put into action what I put, all of these lessons. I go into my house, my wife's in the car with the baby. I quickly get the kayaking stuff ready. Just as I leave the house, that's when the text comes through calling me a man who's trying to drown them. And I slam the door shut like in fright, and I lock myself out. My parents are away for a few weeks. I can see the kayaking stuff from the other side of the door. And it's like a metaphor, like I've lost control now. I can't do anything. And I know I'm not getting the money back. and I'm coming back to the car, and I'm crying, and my wife is trying to say, what's wrong, having just given birth, expecting me within her rights to be like a pillar of like support, and I'm a role model to my kid, and money is no longer something I can accumulate in the future, and it's for what I want to do. It's, I just lost my kid to 2 years of private school education to this guy. um that was the worst moment of my life, and it's years ago now, and I went on to achieve what I wanted to achieve, and I'm welling up as I speak, because the vitriol was so horrific. And I didn't reply for a while, and I said I'm sorry, and I came back on the team, and then I said I can't be on the team, and went off. And I said to him at that point, if you just give me £12,000 back out of the 50, I'll recall it. And he said okay, but then that's never happened. And I knew that our rival team, it was this kayaking team, and they wanted to row the kayak the Northwest Passage, and I knew they needed an extra person. So I called them, and I was like, this has happened. You need an extra person. Can I come? So with like a matter of months to go, I tried to learn how to kayak properly, and went to the Northwest Passage. That's the first time I met them, because they're all American. And then completed the Northwest Passage.
So
the end.
the end. Now, so the moment when they said, yes, you can join us, how did that make you feel after all the emotional pain that this guy had caused you?
Well, again, there was no like movie moment. It's like a process. For one thing, I convinced one of the other guys who was being blamed to come and join us too. And he, having had no kayaking experience, and me having had limited kayaking experience, was like, wanted way more information, and wanted to do some kayaking and trade and whatnot. And so there was like, we're accepted, but we've got to go and see if this is something that Jack wants to do. And then Jack actually joined them in America for some training, having then been accepted on. And then Jack, he left himself too little time to get up to speed. And the fact that he even took the leap is incredibly brave. And so then it was like, he's not coming, and I want to do this from camaraderie and relationships, and I've just lost one of my closest mates who's not coming, and I've had to do it with 3 strangers. Am I making the same mistake? And I even asked Jack, like, do you think we should row around the UK instead? And he was, to his eternal credit, said go for it. And even helped with the food and stuff long after he wasn't in the team. So there was a process, and there were a lot of nerves, and then like it was so hard not to become extrinsic again, because I was like, I'm now in a race against a man who I like livid with, who for taking all my money. I don't want this to be a race. I want to immerse myself in nature. So it was a constant like second guessing about whether or not I'd made the right choice, and whatnot. So it was difficult, but it was also a relief to know that I'm going. And I guess the final relief was they had tried the year before. They'd gone in 3 solo kayaks. They hadn't got as far as they'd expected. They thought if they went in doubles, then they sort some of the issues they had. That's why they had an extra spot. But one of the big problems they had was they started way too late, because of the aeroplanes don't go regularly, and they were just relying on the same aeroplane. So I still felt like I was like, unless they sort this issue, and I'm coming in at the last minute, I'm a newbie, they've all organized it. And I spent a long time trying to find an airplane until I found one that went from central Canada that delivered fruit to an Inuit village like every 2 weeks, and got a reasonable price to get our kayaks on there. And that was the moment I was like, I am definitely going to the Arctic. I know the boat, I know the moments will come. That was a huge moment. And I still think it was my single biggest contribution to the expedition, was finding a fruit plane that got us there in time.
Well, you do kind of need the kayaks there, don't you?
Yeah. I can't remember like a specific moment. It was like nerves, and I had a kid, and there was guilt and whatnot. And and then my wife got pregnant again, which was wonderful, and also more guilt-inducing.
Firstly, explain to listeners, what exactly is the Northwest Passage?
So it's the Arctic route that links the Atlantic to the Pacific. If you want to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific, you can go under South America through the Drake Passage, you can go through the Panama Canal, or you can go over Canada and Alaska, which is obviously the least practical, most miserable, ice-driven route. And Britain in particular thought if we could find it, then it's a shortcut to Asia. And it's not a shortcut to Asia because it's full of ice. Although it is becoming a shortcut to Asia because the ice is disappearing. And in 50 years, people will just go straight over the North Pole rather than around South America or through the Magellan Canal. And as it opens up, people thought, well, maybe the final chapter of this like epic thing is who can get through in a human power. So rowers, kayakers, different various kinds of boats. And even as we went, it was us in two tandem kayaks, the Arctic Cowboys with Wes, Jeff, and Eileen. There was two guys coming from the other end, Matty and Adam, in two single rowing boats. And then there was the other team that I'd previously been with who did make it to the start line in like an 8-person ocean rowing boat that you can sleep and row on at the same time, like the ones you cross the Atlantic in.
So tell me, you've had a lot of setbacks along the way. Your Atlantic attempts, this guy taking your money. You finally get to the start of the Northwest Passage. Tell me about that very first moment when you're standing there ready to leave the shore.
So yeah, we got there for about 5 days, setting up, camping, packing, and then we got the sea is still frozen for about 40 miles around us. So our Inuit contact Titus, his friend Steve, put us on the back of there on a sledge called a kumatuk and pulled us and the kayaks across the ice to the edge of the ice to start. And that was the moment where I'm like, oh, I can't believe I'm starting the Northwest Passage. Like my normal state of mind had become, I'm trying to do this. I'm trying to do this. Now I'm actually doing it. It's difficult to describe. Like,
was it a feeling of calm? Is it anxiety, excitement?
Well, it was like I was trying to take in the moment. I was almost like trying to say, this is the moment I'm starting because there's still so much going on and there's still so much to go. And I was trying not to think about the end and refocus on the adventure and, excitement. And I really, really liked West, Jeff, and Eileen, having only met them for 5 days. And that Kumiktuk ride was like 8 hours of like bumping up and down, miserable. And it was just good fun to like do that together. So, yeah, I mean, I don't have like a pithy, and then, it was just, I was trying to be present.
So now you make it sound like it's going out for a couple of days, but this was actually a 103-day adventure in the Arctic. What was the average day like?
So it was supposed to be a 60-day adventure. You really only have July and August. And all the other people who tried had got to about halfway in 60 days. And then there's an airport and they say, well, we can't take 120 days because September and October, the winter gets too bad there. Like you could go to September if you're close to the end. But so what, you're going to get out, once you commit past the airport, that's your exit point. So we have 60 days really. And there wasn't an average day. In fact, West, our captain, would like bristle at the idea of averages. He got asked a lot about it in the press and the build-up, and sometimes we discussed it as well. And he would always push back, like having an average would frustrate you because you're supposed to average 30 miles a day or whatever. But like you could have 3 days of nothing, then 2 days of 40 miles and 4 days of nothing. And then as the weather got bad, and sure enough, we set out and we got absolutely humbled by the ice. We just had no experience in the ice and it just kicked our ass. And we took 14 hours to try and get back to where we started. And we made 0 miles after 14 hours of me falling through the ice and us getting trapped by the ice and Jeff falling out of the kayak. And, but as we got into the cabin, because it was a little cabin where we started, Eileen turned to us and was like, "We are explorers," and we all like dived into this hug. And I was like, she gets it. It's about the adventure. It's not about like the end. And that was a fantastic 14 hours. But there was the big red flag was just how much slower my kayak was than the other kayak, which is obviously me, not Jeff, because he's like a record-setting kayaker. And West and Eileen in their kayak were actually getting cold going at my speed. It was like they couldn't go my speed. Like as soon as they put their paddles in the water, no matter how little they pushed, they pulled ahead, and then they have to wait. And everybody was worried about that, including myself. In other ways, I then performed very well, and helped people and myself when we fell through the ice. So when they got out, everybody was sort of conflicting. West actually turned to me and was like, "Wow, you are resilient," and I was like, that word is, you don't know what you just validated there, because I've been working on that for years. And then Jeff said, "Oh, you really came alive in the third quarter there," um, and that meant a lot to me. But and then I sped up quickly over the next few days with some coaching from Eileen. And also what I think was, we rushed the packing, so the boats were really overloaded and performing at their absolute worst. Obviously, everybody else was in bad performing boats, but any discrepancy between us was then exaggerated because I was the least experienced kayaker. Um, so there wasn't really an average day. By the second half, when there was nighttime, it imposed a schedule on us. Up at 4 a.m., on the water at 7, kayak for 10 hours, off the water at 5, in bed by dark, most whenever the weather allowed, which was getting less and less frequent. So, first 6 days out of halfway, 40 miles every day, 10 hours, 10 hours, 10 hours, 10 hours. Then the next 10 days, we only kayaked twice because the weather was getting bad. Having said that, even within that, the thing I found most frustrating was how long it took some people to get ready. So up at 4, on the water by 7, was almost always on the water by 8:30.
Mm.
Yeah.
I know that feeling.
Yeah.
So in this 103 days, what was the hardest moment that you faced in the whole expedition?
Good question. I'm trying to think, because it's a difficult question to ask, because by that point, like, I had my intrinsic motivations. I wanted to be challenged, particularly camaraderie. Let's say camaraderie. Like, what is camaraderie? That kind of relationship. You can't build it out of thin air. You need to build it through adversity. My catchphrase for my motivational talks now is like, friendship is formed in good times, camaraderie is formed in tough times. So you get excited about tough times. So now it was like, what are the toughest times? Well, when the times are good, I was like, here we go, we're getting closer to the end. And when the times are bad, I was like, here we go, we're building camaraderie. Dig deep for teammates, they're digging deep for me. So in some ways, the worst times are the best times. But there were a few specific moments that were tough. There was one time sea was coming in from the side, and for some reason, even though my kayaking was improving, it just, like, I couldn't deal with it. I couldn't generate any speed, and everybody was getting cold and frustrated and worried, and that was a lot of, like, for everybody. It must have been miserable for everybody. And there was another day where I was absolutely cooked, and I was at like 30 miles. And I was just pushing myself so hard, and I was close to crying by the end. I thought it was a speed that I couldn't maintain for an hour, but I felt under so much pressure to up my speed from the previous day's side waves. I pushed myself too hard. I was like, I'm just going to go as hard as I can for an hour, and then just go back to a more maintainable space, just to try and claw back some kind of redemption. And I did that for 30 miles, and I couldn't believe that I managed to maintain that pace. And I was close to tears. There was another time where I was just so hungry, and it just hit me like that. I was just kayaking along at 5 miles an hour, and then it went to 2 miles an hour, and nothing I could do could lift it. And I was like, I want to go home. Nobody else is trying. How come me being tired means that we go 2 miles an hour? What the hell is Eileen doing back there? All of these, like, negative thoughts. And as soon as I ate, I was like, oh, I'm not depressed. I'm just really hungry. And like, but that was like, that little 2-minute story is actually like 2 hours of being hungry in a way that I couldn't have possibly imagined before. And so those are the hardest moments. And then more generally, not everybody in the team got along equally. I got along with everybody, and I became the middleman and the peacemaker between fractions. And I found that a huge burden. And I was often having to, I know it's tough, that must be tough. And I just wanted to tell people sometimes, like, grow up, like, we're all tired. But that was definitely the most difficult thing. with having to manage other people's relationships. And everybody's aware of that. And they always acknowledge that I was very good at keeping everybody together, which is nice, but equally like uh, uh, frustrating.
So, was there a moment at all through this where you or the group were thinking about giving up?
So yeah, when we got to halfway, it was about 56 days. And as I say, everybody gets to halfway at 60 days. And then they have to give up because you can't go on. And everybody we spoke to said, winter comes quickly here. Winter comes quickly here. It's like a meme that everybody knew about us. So, we should have and could have stopped, but we just, we didn't have like a specific conversation, but we spoke about like what the conditions could be like in the Beaufort Sea come winter. But, we were like, let's just wait and see and get there. And, different conversations are perceived differently. I thought that we all were like, we're never going to give up unless we run out of food. And obviously, we've got to discuss what happens if we run out of food, or like we might pass the time talking about what do we think life's going to be like in the Beaufort Sea if we get there in October and stuff like that. But nobody was ever thinking of just let's not find out. Let's pull the plug before we get there. But I've seen other interviews from teammates where they've said, I never thought about giving up, but other people were discussing it. I thought, who the hell was discussing it? It wasn't me. Like, it wasn't Eileen.
And you're the mediator, so you would have known everything.
Yeah. So people have different perceptions. I really don't. But I think this is the thing. No matter what tensions we had one thing in common, and that was this group was utterly determined to do every inch of the Northwest Passage. And like all in their own way for different reasons, like, and for the same reasons at the same time. Like Eileen is just so determined and a super proud person. And like, even once we finished the Northwest Passage, we were supposed to do an under 160 miles to get to an Inuit village. That was frozen over and we're running out of food because it was taking 103 days instead of 60. So we went to an airport that was like a abandoned airfield that was 50 miles away. And she felt like that. She felt that very keenly, as though she was quitting. It was like, no, which is obviously ridiculous, but that's how proud and determined she was. Like, Jeff, had completely severed his Achilles and had 2 hernias, but would never let any of us down. And because it's a tandem kayak, he couldn't get out because if one person, you can't do a tandem kayak on your own. So he was determined to finish for all of us.
Wow.
West loves being outside, loves doing the adventure. I don't think it ever crossed West's mind that we wouldn't finish. He's the captain, and yeah, he just thought we would. Wow. And then I have my own reasons: camaraderie, immersion in nature, challenge, and so on. Which when you get like 80 miles to the end, and you think that it might not happen because you're running out of food and weather, it does become quite a lot about finishing, if you know what I mean. But you're trying to focus on your intrinsic nature. But just this group of people were utterly determined. And I guess this is the difference between camaraderie and friendship. Maybe not everybody's equally good friends and they won't have a beer in a week or a year or not, but everybody trusts each other to the nth degree. Everybody knows that everybody there is determined. And no matter what disagreements we have or different memories we have or perspectives on this conflict or that approach or what we should have done here, everybody wanted to finish. Everybody could finish. And maybe people think, oh, I wish I'd done it with somebody who I got along better with. But I know that we did it with 4 people who could and did finish. And it was like the perfect ingredients for a task cohesion, even if social cohesion wasn't always there.
So each night you were camping on the land, you had a run-in with a polar bear.
We had many run-ins with the polar bears, but this one is the one that gets told. It wasn't even the only bear that like woke us up just outside our tent. But it was the one. It was the only one that wouldn't leave. So, we're all lying in our tent, and the tent began to shake, and I was like, "I think that's a polar bear." And she was like, "Oh, it's just the wind, man. Be quiet." I was like, "Oh, okay." So I lay down, and then I heard like a ping, and I swear it was like a guy rope pinging. Something was tripping over it, and I was like, "I really think that's a polar bear." And they were like, "It's not. Just shut up. It's 5 a.m." And then we heard like, at that point, I really thought it was a polar bear. So and West was sitting with his earplugs in, so he didn't even hear it. He just got poked, and he opened his eyes, and we're all looking at him like. Um, and I slowly opened the zip at the front, and the polar bear was perfectly silhouetted against our rain fly. Like all of its teeth was so clearly defined in the shadow, it looked like the Jurassic Park logo. So I grabbed the flare gun, I put it out of the door, and as I say, we've seen lots of bears by this point. I don't know, 20 bears, something. Maybe 15 bears plus their cubs. Something between 15 and 20 would be my guess. And I pulled the trigger. Usually, a bear, even 100 meters away, would sprint away from a flare gun. So to pull a trigger next to a bear's head, it was definitely going to work. And bang, the flare goes off, and shoots into the near side hill, and the bear doesn't move.
Oh, no.
We look at each other. I crawl out the back of the tent and stand up. It's there, and it turns its head to look at me. And we start screaming at it, and the others get out, and we all start throwing stones at it. And almost all of the stones miss, because it turns out, even when their lives depend on it, Americans are shit at cricket. But even the ones that do hit, the bear just sort of barely twitched. And Eileen, who's born and bred in Alaska, seems to be most chilled, so she's popping in and out of the tent, getting us jackets and boots and stuff like that with a bear there. After about 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes, it turned around and walked away just very slowly, and continued to hail of stones at it. And there was no, their initial reaction to my saying that, there was no doubt that I was the most paranoid of bears. I'm British. I don't have much exposure to apex predators. And my teammates are maybe more used to sleeping in an area with grizzly bears or whatnot and relaxing about it. But equally, sometimes I thought that my urgency was being confused for fear. I wanted to take it seriously, get out. You have a gun on it. I'll throw the stones. It's not panicking. It's trying to anticipate. I just walked away. Crazy experience.
So what's going through your mind through all of that?
Yeah, good question. What was I thinking about? Just what to do, so all of these crazy situations where we almost died several times, or could have died, not almost died, but if things had been different, they're only slightly more chaotic than the situations I'd put myself in the build up to the training. So I guess it's like doing a deadlift. I couldn't lift 200 kilograms tomorrow, and if I did, I'd break my back. But I could do 50 kilograms and 55 and 60. And I had done my 50 kilogram deadlift in quite crazy conditions in Hong Kong, and more and more and more. And then by the time I got to the 200 kilogram, almost dying in the Arctic, I was already had the ability to stay calm, but equally be urgent. So I guess part of it is, it's not like a primal fear, like the fight or flight. It's not the flight. It's the absolute binary problem. What email should I do first? Somebody's calling me, but I've got to do this, and the kids need that. There's nothing. It's laser focused. So just throwing stones, and I was trying to get the others to back up. I was saying when it was yawning, I was telling them that means it's baring its teeth, which I think people all thought I was scared. And of course, it's like an adrenaline kind of fear, but it's like a focus, urgency, solution, centric, primal reaction. So there's not really much going on beyond trying to solve the immediate problem. I think we were lucky. I mean, of course we were lucky, because if that bear had been in a different mood, we would have been dead. But
certainly collecting stories to tell your grandkids.
Yes, that's the idea. My mom's very happy.
Now, 103 days of kayaking. You get to the finish. You got 2 world records. How does that feel?
Well, certainly I'm proud, very proud. But now I sort of separate pride and contentment. I'm because I previously linked those two. I'll be so proud of having set a world record in the Atlantic that I'll be content for life. But being proud of something doesn't make you content. There's so many stories of people achieving their dream and then feeling empty afterwards. The most famous in my world, I suppose, would be Johnny Wilkinson winning the World Cup at 23 and then not knowing what to do with himself and being in complete struggling with it really. Um, so the pride comes from the achievement, the contentment comes from these intrinsic motivations. I got everything I was looking for: adventure, which meant camaraderie and immersion in nature, challenging myself. And and I owe it all to Wes, Jeff, and Eileen. Like, yes, we had those tensions, and I found it frustrating being the middleman, but I love them. Um, and I'm so it's it's like a fog is lifted from my eyes because I was so determined to do this at all costs. And people always ask me like, "What's next?" And of course, there's things I want to do, but like I could, everything was clouded and framed through this one after after determination to do this one specific thing at all costs, and to my life, to my money, potentially like leaving my kids fatherless. It all came down to this, and so now I feel so content, and I don't think I would have felt that contentment if I hadn't refocused on what an adventure really is. And I'm also proud in the outcome. Like I'm very proud of the outcome. Um, I'm proud of myself, how I performed um, emotionally, physically, as a mediator, whatnot. I'm proud of how I come out of it. And yeah, so pride and contentment, two different things, and I have them both.
Fantastic. Now, Mark, this all comes down to one choice, and it's the moment you decided to say yes. As you know, the show's called Why Do You Think You Could Do That? So I have to ask you, Mark, from everything, your upbringing, an adventurer father and also mother, uh, your failed Atlantic attempts, and then going out, almost trying to row the Northwest Passage, but then kayaking it. Why did you think you could do that?
Because of the name of this podcast, I have been trying to think of a good answer. Because there were certainly a lot of times where I thought I couldn't do it. Or I've lost my money, I'm never going to do this. Or in the beginning, when we were going very slowly, I was frustrated with different people's approaches to the adventure. I thought we're not going to do this if we continue like this. But why did I think I could do it? I spent so long trying to answer the question, why do I think I want to do this? But I'm not sure if I spent that much time asking the question, why do I think I can do this? And I sort of just thought it can be done. That's why people are trying it. Somebody's going to do it. And why can't that person be me? I didn't explicitly say that. I just sort of assumed that it could be me. And I'm not a particularly physically gifted person. But I've spent so much time asking the why do I want to? And now I think if you answer that question, why do I think I want to do this? Then the can you looks after itself. If you love the pursuit, then the goal will look after itself because you'll stick to the pursuit out of love. The pursuit no longer is an obstacle between you and the goal. It is the goal. And if you're achieving that every day, of course you're going to get to the end. And sure, like you might not get to the end this time and you'll think, oh, that guy on the podcast told me I love the pursuit and I failed now. But then you'll come back or you'll change the pursuit or you'll adapt or become the Atlantic to the Northwest Passage or whatever it is that you want to do. With somebody else who only wants the goal, if they don't achieve the goal, they'll think, well, what was the point? And they're not going to come back tomorrow. So they'll never achieve it, whether or not it's that one or the one they adapt to. If you love the pursuit, the goal looks after itself. I'd say the big secret to that is defining the pursuit. It's the journey, not the destination. Well, what the hell is a journey? It's only defined in relation to the destination. Therefore, it's impossible to separate. That's why I think it's so important to have the language to say, the pursuit for me is either challenge, experience, relationship, or cause. And sometimes a few weeks ago, I went cycling with my dad in the Cairngorms. He's 81. Of course, it was a little bit challenging recycling, but it wasn't like I'm out of my comfort zone. It was all about relationships and experience because I'm doing it with somebody who's special with me in the wild. So you can like pick and choose which of those four do you want. But if you define the pursuit, you can learn to love it. And then if you learn to love it, then the like, can you do this is sort of secondary. So I don't have a good answer. I can tell you why I wanted to do it, and then I think the second answer answers itself.
In my research, I've seen that you've often referred to imposter syndrome. How does that come about?
I think I have imposter syndrome in relation to being a motivational speaker now, because I think, like, what have I got to tell people? I sort of feel like a bit of a hypocrite going up there and telling people how to live their lives. Um, and like, so much of the success in this is like, I'm come from a comfortable background, and it's not that anybody paid for it for me, but I know that if I'll never be homeless, I always have a bed to go to and a hot meal. So suddenly you can take risks. And now I'm telling people, like, love the pursuit. So that's where I have imposter syndrome. Um, but and I try and deal with that with the fact that I guess this is an exceptional thing to do. I mean, I feel like if I can do it, anybody can do it, because I have no particular background in kayaking. Um, I, well, what does that say about it? So,
Yeah,
yeah,
but
I guess
it's the
yeah,
willingness to get out there. It's the ability to say yes to something that most people would say is impossible, or you're stupid, you're crazy. And just because you said yes to it, that's what gives you the right to get up on that stage and hopefully interact with people and make them motivated to say yes as well to their own challenge, their own path.
yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, people sometimes ask me how long it took to train, and it was a matter of months. But in other ways, it was like 8 years, because doing all of the different things I did, from training for the first Atlantic to the Northwest Passage, it sort of embeds mentally and physically. So it wasn't like, oh yeah, I did 4 months dedicated training. Well, that was really like sharpening the pyramid after 8 years of being comfortable in the outdoors. Um, so maybe I'm doing myself a discredit by saying, oh, anybody can do it, but equally, like, maybe a lot of people could have done it, but I guess they didn't, and that's the point. Um, one of my other, like, things I say in my speech is, those who believe they can and those who believe they can't are both exactly the same. It's only doers who are different. So maybe I need to listen to my own speech and give myself credit for being a doer. But
So, after finishing the Northwest Passage, Mark, do you consider yourself a man who does adventures or an adventurer?
this is a big irony here. In the build up to doing the Northwest Passage, for the years living in Hong Kong, and then before that, I was out doing stuff all the time. Hong Kong, it's super accessible. And then back in the UK, I was making a point of it. And whether that was hiking at the weekend or doing a trail run, or even hiking after work during the week. And then I was kayaking, and we were camping, and I did rock climbing. And there was a big rock climbing crag like above the city. I'd meet my friend James at like 5 a.m. and we'd rock climb. And I was thinking, God, I want to be an adventurer. And now I have kids and I live in London. When I went cycling the other day with my dad, and then about a week before that, I went cycling with my friend from Hong Kong through the South Down Way, which is like a 100-mile route, um, just south of London. I was like, this is the first time I've done anything that could be considered adventurous since the Northwest Passage 2 years ago. So I was an adventurer. And then I became European Adventurer of the Year, and then I've done nothing since. So am I an adventurer anymore? So I was like, am I an adventurer yet? And now I'm asking, am I an adventurer anymore? So, like, the irony is, it's all through perspective. Yeah. I mean, this is a quote from another adventurer who I admire, called Al Humphreys. If you feel like you're on an adventure, then you are. And, yeah, so I guess the big difference is, I don't have an existential crushing urge to answer the question. I'm content. I'm very fulfilled. I have meaning in a lot of things I do, and I'm sure I'll do something again in the future, and that will bring me fulfillment and joy and pride and contentment. Um, and that, I mean, the idea of doing something with my kids, who are too young to do anything at the moment, but like, whether that's hiking or, I don't know, setting a world first or whatever, anything in between, doing it with them, God, that would be the pinnacle. So, am I an adventurer? Am I somebody who does adventure? I'm certainly not somebody who does adventure at the moment, but I am somebody who's content not to answer that question. And
Fair enough then.
fair enough, 5 years ago, it would have eaten me alive.
Yeah, right. So you and I both know that every great journey, it leaves us changed. How did the Northwest Passage change you as a person?
The big change came after the second failed Atlantic. So by the time I got to the Northwest Passage, I'd done so much mental training and got so into so many reckless, but on a reckless, I know that they were stupid. And sometimes I thought to myself, I should turn around, but I'm here to build mental strength. That's the point. And I crossed the line from objective risk to reckless risk so that I was completely calm in the Northwest Passage. And yes, I tested all of that theory in the Northwest Passage and confirmed that I was like completely with it. So I guess it didn't change me so much as like the failed second Atlantic did. That's my fork in the road. Things that I learned about myself was that the being middle person also revealed that I'm like bad with conflict, and maybe I could have dealt with that better by challenging people and saying, I know that you're struggling, but like, don't you think that? But I never followed up with a, don't you think that you should? And that may have facilitated and enabled attention to continue. So that's what I've learned. But yeah, so my fork in the road was the second failure. And the Northwest Passage, I don't think I learned anything specific about myself, but it's definitely made me like more content and fulfilled and lifted this fog from me where I was under so much pressure from nobody but myself to do it.
Mm. Now, to be honest, Mark, most of us aren't going to kayak the Arctic, but bravery, it shows up in other ways. So do you think that there's any lessons from the Arctic that someone can apply in their everyday life?
I hope so, because it's my whole job now, giving a motivated talks about it. So yeah, I guess only because you specifically said the word bravery, I'll answer to that. I think people sometimes confuse being tough and being resilient. They say they use the words interchangeably, but they're not. Being tough is the ability to suffer through something, get on with it, finish. And you need that. That is an element of resilience. But resilience has so many more branches. And if you're too tough, you can't access the other branches of resilience, like being able to adapt. You know, if you're so focused and so tough, you can't adapt, then it undermines your resilience. Camaraderie, teamwork, accessing support, listening to feedback, that all makes you more resilient. But if you're too tough, then you won't be able to lean on other people because you think that it's about self-reliance. Resilience is also about what happens afterwards, post-traumatic growth or post-traumatic stress. And if you're too tough to confront your emotions, then you're not going to be able to turn PTSD into post-traumatic growth, where you learn from something and go on. So the ability to laugh at yourself and think this is ridiculous and then sort of shrug it off and get on, you know, that means you can enjoy it. It means you can connect with other people. It gives you the space to adapt. And if you're too tough to do that, then you're not going to be resilient. So yes, if you want to be resilient, you have to be tough. But if you're too tough, then you can't be resilient. So give yourself some compassion, allow yourself to laugh, be brave enough to know that adapting is not the same as quitting. Know that getting help and connecting other people is not the same as not being tough.
So then what do you think would be one small act of courage that someone listening could take tomorrow to really change their trajectory?
One thing that they could do tomorrow, this is a really good one. One thing you could do tomorrow, if you're struggling, you know, try and find meaning in struggle. You know, by instead of saying it's an obstacle, say it's a challenge. I'm challenging myself. If you frame it in like not in just an individual context of that particular challenge, but in the context of a broader journey, you know, we're all on this journey. It's not going to be linear like this. It's going to go up and down and up and down. You know, I read the other day about speech psychology. It said if you frame life in that you're on a hero's journey, then suddenly the call to action could be the challenge, and then the moment when you think you're going to fail is like the second peak in the movie where, you know, you think you're at Mount Doom and then there's suddenly a big spider. And if you frame it in that, it suddenly is contextualized in this much broader struggle, rather than just like an individual obstacle that happens to be annoying you today. And it brings meaning to everything. So, um, yeah, I always come back to those intrinsic motivations, and, uh, whether that's challenge, relationships, experience, or causes. And somebody asked me the other day in one of my talks, don't you think that's a point of privilege? He was the first person in his family to go to college, and his parents had to work really hard to get in there. And now I'm telling them to enjoy the journey. But, if compared to another family in the same situation, who's going to find the extra drive and meaning? The person who wants to accumulate more money to change their situation, which is, if you're from a disadvantaged background, I'm not dismissing that. Or the person who's trying to send their first kid to college. Well, that's a relationship goal, an intrinsic driver. One, that they were found an extra lever to go incredibly hard to do good by their son. So, no matter how serious or not serious, there's always a way that you can frame it to have an intrinsic motivation, give yourself meaning, give yourself purpose, and contextualize. And I'm not saying enjoy the journey. I'm just saying find meaning in it. It doesn't make it any easier. It just makes it more tolerable and meaningful.
Fantastic words there, Mark. Now, I love to finish every interview with the Brave Five. It's rapid fire 5 questions, Mark.
God, I'll try and be rapid fire. I know I've been waffling.
Now, don't expect everyone to relate to the other. They could be quite random. So you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. I'm excited.
Very good. All right. The most unexpected takeaway from your journeys?
Most unexpected takeaway is that being tough is not being tough. Knowing your why makes you resilient more than having the ability to grin your teeth and go through pain.
Fantastic. Now, the first emotion you felt after finishing the Northwest Passage?
Like, as we were picked up in the airplane, this tiny, tiny airplane that was so small, we just saw our kayaks in half to pick them up in the plane. And looking out of the window, it was a whole bunch of emotions: relief, redemption, catharsis, but also in a way disbelief. The vastness of the landscape sort of opening up below us through the window as we crawled in the skies. I can't believe we were part of that.
Wow. One thing you wish you knew before you started?
That technique counts more than fitness. And if I'd spent more time on my technique, I would have been faster, even if it meant arriving less fit.
Okay. A habit or a mindset that made the biggest difference?
My mindset the biggest difference was my mindset from really, really, really wanting to set the world first to really, really, really wanting to be immersed in nature and have an experience of camaraderie.
Fantastic. And last question, best advice you've ever received on an expedition?
Advice I've ever received on an expedition? It's probably just a really boring practical one. In fog, on the water, if you try and look at the water, there is always a little bit of a wave or a ripple. And if you can sort of keep your eye on that, and they begin to change direction, like they begin to hit the boat from the side, doesn't mean the wind's changed. It just means you've changed direction. It's very disorientating in fog. And in the Northwest Passage, I was incredibly competent at navigating through fog. And it was because I was keeping my eye on those waves. And I learned that from the guy who took my money for rowing the Northwest Passage. So, thank you. That's £50,000 worth of advice.
All right. Mark, your story reminds us that bravery isn't found in the moments when everything is going right. It's forged in the cold, lonely hours when the waves are against you, the ice is closing in, and failure feels like the only option. Twice Mark pulled out of the Atlantic, convinced his dreams had ended, but he chose to get back up. He chose to risk failing again. And that choice, that decision to keep paddling when no one else would, is what carried him to the Northwest Passage, 2 world records, and a place in history. Maybe you'll never face polar bears on the ice, but we all face our own Northwest Passage. The business you dream of starting, the bold goal you keep putting off, the fear that whispers you're not enough. That question is not whether you could do what Mark did. The question is, will you ever take your next step, even when it feels impossible? Now, Mark, for those listening who want to follow your adventures, find your book, or even bring you in to share your story, where's the best place for them to connect with you?
Well, my website, adventureagnew.com, and my Instagram, also adventureagnew.com. You can get my book, There Will Be Headwinds, Kayaking the Northwest Passage by Mark Agnew. Just Google it or connect with me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way. Mark Agnew. Search me and you should find me on there.
Fantastic. And I'll make sure I put all of those links into the show notes. And if this conversation has sparked something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with a friend, a colleague, or someone who needs a reminder that failure is not the end. It's the beginning of something greater. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next story of ordinary people saying yes to the impossible, because bravery spreads and your share just might spark someone else's first step. I'm Sam Penny, and this is Why Do You Think You Could Do That? Until next time, keep saying yes to the impossible.